This Stealing the Mind Bible Conference presentation is by Wayne Jett and is entitled The Maddening Murder of the Middle Class. For a free catalog of over 250 awesome Bible studies on DVD or CD, call Compass at 1-800-977-2177 or on the web at compass.org.
I want to begin by asking you to consider a question for yourself, and that is, our whole lives we've heard about nations in which the people have had governments that have acted against them, that have oppressed them. We've always separated ourselves from that experience and believed as Americans how grateful we can be for that not having been our experience. I want to ask you to consider how it affects your thinking about your government if you find out that is not the case. I begin by saying to you a couple or three conclusions that I have reached. I do not think these are conspiracy theories. These are conclusions based upon my review and research of the facts. And I'm going to try to share as many of the facts as I can with you this afternoon. The United States of America has a ruling elite. It dominates the U.S. financial markets. It dominates each branch of the United States government. It dominates and owns, in most cases, the major media. And if any media is important enough to get out of line, they own them tomorrow morning. That is why you have reporters that are so-called intellectual liberals. They do their reporting to keep their jobs. That's why we have certain kinds of media reporting and we don't have other kinds. The characteristics of this ruling elite is, number one, they are above the law, and they expect in every respect to remain in that condition. Their agenda is to destroy the middle class. The middle class, I do not mean middle-income people. The middle class is the great body of people that came up between the slaves and the ruling elite and fought for their political rights, won their political rights, and then won economic rights through politics in order to prosper. That's the middle class I'm talking about, and the very people that are being treated by our media as if they are the wealthy elite now are the most successful people of the middle class. They're being treated as if they're the warlords against the middle class and the poor, when actually they are the prime target of the real ruling elite. They are the most influential people in the country. They're the ones that can afford to support politicians and to influence politics, and that's why they are the target to be wiped out, not only by the kinds of actions that our government takes in general, but by the progressive income tax. Of course, they insist that in the media that there is no ruling elite. But it's been the case that people who have investigated and thought about it have believed the contrary for many years, back into the 1800s. I want to quote here for you from a book that was published in 1879, self-published by a California newspaper man, which became the best-selling book on economics in the history of the world. His name was Henry George. He was from Oakland, and he was basically about to go out of business. He wrote Progress and Poverty, and he did it during the longest depression in the history of the United States. That was from 1873 through 1879, in which we had a continuous contraction of the economy that was, as I analyze in my book, was done by statute in revaluing the dollar to a higher price than it was. It caused deflation that made prices go down even though the country was booming and we had bankruptcies all over the place. But here is a key statement made by Henry George in that book toward the end. That book, by the way, it was a bestseller because it is the most eloquent book I've picked up. Written by a man out here in 1879 and 1876 when he was going bankrupt in his little newspaper, and it is as well written a book as I have ever read. He says this toward the end of the book. In every country, a vast and dominant pecuniary interest exerts active, energetic power to write laws and mold thoughts. That was the condition then, it's the condition now. He couldn't have said it better for right now. That vast and dominant pecuniary interest is what I call the ruling elite. And it is much more vast and much more powerful now than when Henry George spoke. Henry George, after getting that republished in 1880 by a New York publisher, that book sold more than 2 million copies in the next 20 years. He became one of the 3 most admired men in the United States before his death in 1898, when he was, I think, just about to be elected to the mayorship of New York. 2 or 3 weeks before his election, or before the election, he died. In 1901, when Progress and Poverty was just about at the height of its popularity, here is the man who came onto the intellectual scene in New York. H.G. Wells, a British writer who had written nothing but fiction, science fiction, and horror stories, things of that sort. But he wrote a book called, the short name for it is Anticipations, published in 1901. And it made him an intellectual star. It turns out, I got a copy of it. It's very hard to get. Actually, the only copy I could find was online for the University of Chicago Library. There is one copy, other than that I know, in a hard copy that's locked away in a private foundation library in California, not far from where I live. But this Anticipations turns out to be a manifesto for the ruling elite. It gave Wells so much intellectual gravitas that he was promptly invited over to the United States and ushered it by the intellectuals of the East into the White House of Theodore Roosevelt, where he was the honored guest, and he came out praising Teddy Roosevelt as the human demigod of whom I have dreamed. That was not the end of him by any means. The book has been deep-sixed in large part because of what it says. I've read it, and it is the most diabolical writing I've ever had in my hands. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what he said about it, said in it. It professes one world government. He says that a new republic should be set up. Democracy is a dictatorship that is imposed upon the people who are entitled by birth to rule, and it must be done away with. That historically there was only a 2-class system, a very stable system, the rulers and those who served them. And that's what we have to go back to. But in order to do that, the middle class must be wiped out, and in order to wipe out the middle class, you have to destroy the entire fabric of Western civilization. This is what was in his book, and it got him an invitation to the White House. One world government is certainly on his agenda. And he said that the way we're going to accomplish this is in a secret society that we will call the New Republic. The New Republic, as a secret society, will form a shadow government of existing government organizations, and slowly over the years will influence and undermine and undercut, and finally the existing government will fall of its own accord, and we will be ready to take full power. So that is leads us up to this. He says by the year 2000, this is writing in 1901, by the year 2000, the ascendant nations of the world, the ones who will be the leaders of the world, will be the ones who have learned how to poison the people of the abyss. He defines those in some detail. But these men of the new republic are going to be men of a certain kind. The ones entitled and able to take full power will be those who can live by a new religion, a new moral principle that does not say there's no God. It says that whatever my will is God's will. And so therefore, you can kill, you can destroy, you can render destruction of all kinds, and it will be God's will. He was invited, now this was in 1901, and you would think that maybe he would have been outed over a period of time. I think in part he was probably invited in by Teddy for a little counseling that you have to be a little more reserved in exactly to whom you address these entreaties in your book. Nevertheless, by the time Franklin Roosevelt took office, he was invited to the Franklin Roosevelt White House at least 3 times for extended conferences with Franklin, with Eleanor, and with the Brain Trust. And of all the leaders of the world that H.G. Wells had the opportunity to sing praises to, Franklin Roosevelt ranked at the top. The most admired, another one that he admired greatly was Joseph Stalin. He called him a great disinterested leader for the Russian people. He saw the FDR Brain Trust as the kind of men capable of taking full power. That's what he said in the 30s. I think he was still thinking about anticipations. I don't think he had mellowed. In fact, he continued writing about one world government and the New World Order and so forth right through the time of his final demise after World War II. Now, this Wells book, I'll say one more thing. There's the disinterested leader on the left, and of course, the final solution that Hitler used, I think, had a lot of identification in poisoning people of the abyss. The Jewish people were one of the ones defined in the book in 1901 as being the kinds of people who are in that category, needing to be destroyed. Other people were those of black skin, brown skin, yellow skin, and dirty white skin. Does that ring any bells to you? I am going to move now to the time of Franklin Roosevelt in particular, and to a letter that he wrote. This is a personal letter that he wrote in November of 1933. This is his first year in office. He's been elected by the poor people, the ones who are wanting to get away from Hoovervilles and the kind of depression we already had then. And he's writing this to E.M. House, Edward M. House, who was, during the Woodrow Wilson administration, the go-between between Wilson and the ruling elite. He was the Wall Street go-between to get such things done as the Federal Reserve and the progressive income tax. He was the go-between for such things as subverting Woodrow Wilson from the Democratic Party to become one of the ruling elite, when it was the Democratic Party who had put Andrew Jackson in power in the first place in 1928 as the first Democratic Party candidate on the basis of his willingness to fight the central bank of that time and to end its charter. And yet what he writes here is, the real truth is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the larger centers has owned the government. He's talking about the United States government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson. The days of Andrew Jackson ended in 1836, when he had ended the central bank at that time, and the ruling elite had called a depression upon the country at that time as well. So there we have it, a financial element in the larger centers. That would have included not just New York, it would have included London and Paris and Amsterdam, for example. So this is an international ruling elite, but one with which Franklin Roosevelt was intimately familiar. He was one of them. He was not the traitor to the ruling elite, to his class. He was the traitor to the people who had voted him into office. He was from the day he was elected. Even members of his brain trust said he was a professional actor. He was completely capable in making anybody think whatever he wanted them to think in any particular appearance that he made. That was the way he operated to deceive the people. He was the field marshal for the war against the middle class, and he was elected in 1933 to do three things, all of which were bad mistakes by Herbert Hoover. Hoover had signed the Smoot-Hawley Act, which raised tariffs to historic highs, and when he did that, it basically shut down world trade. By the end of 1931, he signed it in 1930 June. By the end of 31, we had 25% unemployment, and we had world trade had dropped more than 2/3, imports and exports. So there's no question Smoot-Hawley was devastating, and the Democratic Party was historically absolutely pro-low tariff. So Democrats in electing him would have believed that he was going to reduce tariffs as he had intimated he would during the campaign. He did exactly the opposite. He had recruited a Secretary of State who was strongly low tariff, but when his Secretary of State had set a world conference in London and was there negotiating to reduce tariffs, FDR was the one who gave a speech from Washington blowing it out of the water on the day that the agreement was supposed to be made. So it completely nullified the possibility of lower tariffs, and Roosevelt did it. The second thing he was elected to do was to cut the tax rates that had been quadrupled in 1932 and made retroactive to the beginning of 32. That's why we had a run on the banks in March of 1933. All income taxes were due then on March 15th. And during the year, the Congress had followed Hoover's request to raise income taxes to balance the budget. They quadrupled the lowest rate, trebled the highest rate, and all of it was due March 15th. There was no withholding at that time. So the run on the banks was people going to the banks to get their money out to send it to Washington. That's why we had the bank emergency. So we come to that circumstance of what he does with it. Franklin Roosevelt not only did not reduce taxes, he raised taxes every year he was in office except one, and that was the year 1939 when the Democratic House had lost 80 seats in the 38 elections, and they wouldn't do it. And he wouldn't sign the little bitty tax bill that they did to reduce taxes just a little bit. He just let it become law without signing it. So, but I need to go back to this letter of November 33, because there is an even more important sentence in that same letter that I want to give it to you now. The sentence immediately following the one that I just told you about, which says the real truth is that our government's been owned by the financial sector. Here's what he says next. The country is going through a repetition of Jackson's fight with the Bank of the United States, only on a far bigger and broader scale. He's telling you the Great Depression was a fight with the central bankers. Have you ever heard that before? Never in your life, I'll bet. Except it's on a far bigger and broader scale, because this time the president wasn't on the side of the people. He was on the other side, and the fight was being taken directly against the people by the central bankers. That's what the Great Depression was about. I'm going to tell you some more of what it was about. It wasn't just the central bankers. Yes, they're behind it. Yes, the ruling elite was behind the central bankers. But Roosevelt was the one doing their dirty work. And he was doing it with his own hands. I've identified in my book 10 lines of action that he took. Every one of them seriously, I believe intentionally, destructive to the interests of ordinary Americans and the economy as a whole. 10 of them. Today, I only have time to talk about one of them, and so I'm going to talk about what I think is the most important one of them, although there's another one of them that is sort of more like a smoking gun. But this one is undeniable. Between 1933, when he was elected, first year he was elected, by the middle of the summer, he was already using tax money to buy gold for the U.S. Treasury. Between 1933 and 1940, he bought 13,185 metric tons of gold. And he brought it to the United States and he stored it in Fort Knox, or whatever he did with it. He took it out of the monetary system of the gold standard. The gold standard required every nation participating in it to print currency in the full amount of the value of the gold it held, so that if it had more gold than somebody else, it had more currency and their people could buy more things and there would be mutual assured prosperity. By buying this much gold, I'm going to show you how much that was 130% of the amount of gold held by all other governments in 1930. He bought 30% more than the gold held by every other country, and he took it to Fort Knox and took it out of the monetary system so there could not be a currency made based on that gold. That meant there was such a shrinkage of money in the world that everybody went into poverty. And it was especially bad in the United States because he not only shrank our money supply that way, but he used the money that we had as taxes to buy the gold in the first place. That is the reason why the United States of America had a more severe depression than any other country in the world. There were actually other countries selling their gold at that time in order to provide for their people. He was using the people's money to buy gold and sap money out of the system and to make certain that the gold standard would be destroyed, because there simply was not enough gold to create enough money for people to be able to thrive and survive. So I want to show you this graph. I've never seen one like it. I'm the one who prepared this one. And I even brought a little laser here because I want to make sure you see this dot right there, just before the giant jump up. That's those 5-year increments. That's 1930. That's 1935. That's 1940. That goes back to 1900, the amount of gold that had been accumulated in the entire history of the United States up to that time. You can see that we had prosperous times in the first part of the century. It was gradually increasing. But look at what shows as the greatest leap by far in our gold accumulation was the absolute most impoverished by far in our nation's history, the Great Depression. That was what he was doing to our country on purpose at the time that we were starving. And I'm not talking about people being hungry. I'm talking about people starving to death. There were millions of diet diseases that destroyed young lives and old lives. And people didn't come running to the government and says, I'm starving to death. A lot of people were too proud about it. And a lot of people had this belief that the problem was theirs. They just weren't smart enough, or they just weren't able enough. But people were proud enough and that smart enough that they knew something was being done beyond the information they had. I wanted to make sure you saw that because it is completely striking to me. So he violated the gold rule. That's why we lost the gold standard. He shrank the money supply and made certain there was a depression. But I'm telling you, that is 1 out of the 10 of the things that he did. That one would have been enough to make a severe depression beyond any question in my mind, and I say that as a classical economist, not as a Keynesian. Now historians can explain, as I have, why we had a worse depression than any other country in the world. I want to skip now to later time. I'll mention, in leaving World War II, it's repeated time and again that World War II ended the Great Depression. It did not. We simply sent those unemployed to war. We put industries to work in producing war material. But the kinds of limitations, the high taxes, all of the bad economic policies that FDR had imposed continued through the war, and I'm convinced we only got out of the Depression because he died in the spring of 1945. I'm going to proceed to after World War II now, and they certainly didn't go away after Roosevelt. President Richard Nixon, on August 15, 1971, issued an executive order that closed the gold window, which was, since 1945, the Bretton Woods Agreement, or 44, I guess, we'd made this deal that all the other central banks could bring their gold and we'd bring their dollars. If they had extra dollars, bring them, we'll give them gold for it. And they could do that, and we kept the gold, we kept that standard fairly well stable. But particularly in the 60s, the government wanted to have more of the bit in its teeth and start spending more money, and particularly they wanted to pay for the Vietnam War without raising taxes and without raising interest rates. And so they started issuing too much money. And obviously, that too much money winds up in the European banks, and they come over and they want gold for it. And so our gold supply starts dwindling down the way you saw that graph dropping. Well, all they had to do to stop the gold from going out was stop issuing too much money. It would have been over. And people would have been coming back and regarding the dollar as solid and equal to the same amount of gold, and so they wouldn't have any need for the gold. They'd use dollars for their business. But nevertheless, he ended that, and he gave, and within 2 years, the dollar had dropped 75% in value. You can tell that because of the price of gold. It went from $35 to $140 an ounce by the end of 72. And as soon as he was reelected, instead of going back to the gold standard, which he should have done, he would have had to admit we've had a 75% devaluation. He wasn't willing to do that, and so therefore he just gave the Fed the power to manage the value of the dollar and to do as they see fit. And that has been our downfall ever since. It has made all the difference. But in the circumstances of Nixon's case, I frankly don't know why he was impeached. He delivered for them. You know, Kissinger was a Rockefeller man. Paul Volcker was a Rockefeller man. Volcker was the brains in the Treasury Department under Connally at that time that advised him we have to leave the gold standard and we have to close the gold window, and got us into this whole thing. So the hand of the ruling elite is very much involved there in a Republican administration as well as in Democrats. They've responded to this thing about inflating and devaluing the dollar in a very deceptive way. They've done things such as, I'm going to tell you first about how the middle class loses. You know about it already, but in inflation, you lose your value of your savings. In deflation, you lose jobs and profitability, because in deflation, you have to lower prices because of the higher valued dollar. The Federal Reserve insiders are the ones that basically own the Fed. The Federal Reserve is owned by the banks of the country. More than half of the controlling interest of the Fed is owned by the big New York banks, the international banks. So they tell them what to do, and the action of the Federal Reserve is done in New York at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It's not this thing that we see out of Washington with the intellectual heads pondering about what should be done for the interests of the people. That's where the action takes place. But the insiders there are the big banks that own them. They not only know what the Fed's going to do, I'm convinced that they tell the Fed what to do. And the intellectuals in Washington are the ones that have the problem of coming up with an alibi for why we're doing this, or at least not telling people what's actually being done. Now, you remember that when he came, the same day that he closed the gold window was exactly the day that the bigger headlines were that he established a cost of living council and a wage price control and a fight inflation program. So he's fighting inflation, he says in public, when the specific policy action that he took that day was to devalue the dollar. Now, if this isn't direct lying to the people, I don't know what is. Remember this one under President Ford, the Whip Inflation Now program. President Ford's solution, the win button. This is a propaganda of a kind that is simply lying to the people. It cannot be alibied for as just politics. This is so directly relevant, so directly important to our survival and prosperity that we must depend and demand truthfulness on matters of this kind. These are the kinds of things that people have for centuries have fought and died about, and yet when our politicians say something about them, we think, well, you can just expect politicians to lie. The Federal Reserve to this day follows, and it says, Bernanke has said in writing, that they follow the Phillips curve theory, which says that in order to fight inflation, you have to destroy jobs. Believe it or not, this is what they say, and they say that the way it stops inflation from going up, see, they pull sleight of hand. They don't really say what monetary inflation is. They call inflation when prices go up. Well, they say if you fire a lot of people from their jobs, they can't afford anything, they can't pay higher prices, the prices don't go up. We're fighting inflation. This is absolutely not only immoral, it ought to be criminal. And yet we're taking it as if, well, this is just the way that politics work these days. That ties in very much to what they did in 2006, 2007, and 2008, but I'll get into that a little bit later. But obviously, jobs don't cause inflation, monetary policy does, and the Fed knows this. They know exactly what causes it. They know that when they're putting out more money, then the economy is growing. A value of money that is greater than the new goods and services produced and the growth in the economy. There's going to be a devaluation of the dollar because those new dollars go into the same pool as all the existing dollars, and all of a sudden, there are more dollars buying the same amount of stuff. And that means that the prices will go up. And the value of the dollar, each dollar, will go down. That's what inflation is. And deflation is exactly the same in the reverse direction, and it's at least as destructive as inflation is. Both of them are a corruption of the primary principle of classical economics, and that is you must have stable money. You have to have stable unit value in your currency, or the entire economy loses efficiency drastically, because everybody has to spend every working minute thinking about how they must change their prices and their production in order to adjust to the changing value of money that they are just absolutely having to guess about. At least with FDR, when he devalued the dollar in January of 34, he told us the amount it was devalued, 41%. Here's another way they lie to us. And what really gets my goat is that even good supply-side economists, the ones who are right about tax policy at least, they seem to become Keynesians when it comes to monetary policy. I'll go this far. They want to have a stable dollar, but they think they can get it by messing with interest rates. It's impossible to do. It can be proved with a simple mathematical formula. I challenge any economist to write me a formula that computes the value of the dollar, that shows a formula that has anything to do with the overnight funds rate. There is no such formula. If there were such a formula, there's nothing that you could do to the overnight rate that would have any kind of a controlling influence on the value of the dollar. That overnight funds rate is a complete deception, and I'm going to tell you why. They say they announced the funds rate target as something that is their target, and then they adjust the amount of money they're putting out, and this causes the banks with competition in the market operation and so forth to come to that rate, and therefore it adjusts the valve on the amount of liquidity flowing into the economy. I don't believe that, any of it. It's false. What they do is they announce the target, which is the target the big banks want, and the big banks then use that target immediately the same day. They adjust their prime rate of lending to everybody else. They are fixing prices on credit, and they're using the Fed to help them, and by doing so, they evade the criminal antitrust laws against price fixing. And they fix the price of the most important product in the world, which is the product of credit for money. So that's how we get the interest rates all of a sudden going to that. Everyone sets the prime rate 3 points above the overnight rate, and then they set their lending rates above that. Apart from that, the Fed does whatever it wants to with liquidity behind the scenes. It either puts out quite a few dollars, or it brings in dollars, soaks them up. By doing that, the public, investors at large who are not insiders, are completely confused because they think if interest rates are a certain level, the economy is going to act a certain way. The economy acts completely differently depending upon whether the Fed is sucking in dollars or putting more dollars out. And unless you know what they're really doing, you're in big trouble in trying to predict it. Okay, we get to the crash of 2000-2002. They call it the tech bubble. They call it all of that crazy speculation on Wall Street. I'm going to tell you what I believe actually was the mechanics of how that crash happened. I think it was the worst crash we've had since the crash of '29. 3 years of descending stock market, and basically it went from around 14,000 on the Dow to 7,200 or so. So about a 50% drop. There were two primary factors involved, and I'll describe them just briefly as I can. Deflation was created by the Fed as recently as the years between 96 and 99. The way I know this is that the gold price went from over $400 an ounce in 96 to $252 an ounce in 99. Now, that was a 37% increase in the value of the dollar in 3 years. One of the things that happens, spot markets price commodities and products right now. What are you going to pay for it today? Like oil and things like that, or cotton or commodities, things like that. So when there's a devaluation of the dollar, it adjusts immediately. Those prices fall. And so people in commodities and that sort of thing, all of a sudden, they're losing money, and investors don't want to buy them anymore. They move someplace else. And so this started in 96 through 99. Oil, you might recall, went to something like $9 a barrel in 98. So in that circumstance, we come on into 99 and then the breaking of the year 2000. And what was happening is that by this devaluation, this deflation by the Fed, secretly, they never indicated to anybody outside the insiders that they were doing this. They concealed it completely. But it was driving capital out of one sector after another, from the commodities and then the basic industries and so forth and so on. And all the capital went into what looked like was still profitable, high tech. Blew the prices up through the roof. What happened is the insiders knew about the deflation. They knew the deflation was going to catch the tech sector. And so they got ready for a holiday. The best holiday in the world in the financial sector is a great crash. They make money faster than at any other time in their lives. All they have to do is get short, and get short in all of the imaginative ways. You think getting short in 29 was something. There were those who got short. For example, in 29, one of the greatest guys getting short was Joseph P. Kennedy, who became FDR's first SEC chairman. All they had to do is be short, and they were able to kill the tech stocks overnight. And it was a great sensation. Those two things alone. Now, in the crash of 2008, it was more complicated. And I'm going to tell you about what factors they were. I did have these on the slide, but The first thing they used was the inverted yield curve, in which the overnight rate is higher than the 30-year rate or the 10-year rate. And so what that is actually doing, the overnight rate from the Fed was so high that all small business that borrows from banks were out of the market because it was so high, it was so far above market, they couldn't borrow, and that shut down hundreds of thousands of jobs by the month. That's how the Fed put business out. And when they do that, they cut people off, they can't pay their mortgages. All these deadbeats we keep hearing about, no, those were people that the Fed put out of work on purpose. And they were supposedly doing so. They did it in 2006. They stopped any money creation. And those years that were supposedly blowing the housing up so high, they never put out more than $40 billion in a year. Now, just last week, Bernanke says he's going to put $40 billion out in a month, every month. That's one of the things. The repeal of the uptick rule by the SEC that slows down the shorting, got it completely out of the way. The Madoff exception rule, that was an exception that allowed counterfeiting of stock in uncounted shares, non-delivery. They just sell it without having to borrow the stock or deliver it. They sell it short. It's called naked short selling. And the SEC expressly permitted that. The cash settlement credit default swaps, the ABX index in London, all of these were rigged in such a way as to come into place in mid-2007 so that they could first kill the housing industry and kill the mortgage industry, all of it by counterfeiting shares. They killed all of them practically overnight with these new rules they had. And then at the end of 2007, they were ready for the big game, and they used the same kind of naked short selling to kill Bear Stearns and to kill Fannie and Freddie. The game still is right now. You know, Fannie and Freddie, all that toxic stuff, it's not toxic. The way those certain banks were blown up is by creating fake loans and then using credit default swaps and other derivatives to multiply them 1,000-fold. And then they put those into a single CD or CDO and sell it to an institution, and you know it's going to blow up. So then you just short their stock. And so they killed all of those. Fannie and Freddie were trading over 400 million shares a day, daily, of this naked short selling. They had 4 weeks in which the SEC jumped up and said, no naked short selling of these stocks. The trading dropped to under 40 for sure, and down to 20 in the case of one of them. It was so rampant, and yet the SEC, and of course, winds up doing absolutely nothing. With the limited time, I can only tell you that this is one way they loot the middle class, they destroy the middle class. A secret classified report to the Pentagon in 2009 concluded exactly the same analysis that I had, except mine is more detailed, saying and concluding that $13 trillion was looted from the American public in 2008 alone by that financial terrorism is what they called. And they said, these financial terrorists, we can't tell. We've been asked, are they domestic or foreign? They say, we can't tell for sure because we haven't been given the data to identify who the parties are, but they look an awful lot like domestic because they got so much help from our regulators. So I'll just wind up by saying that financial terrorism is not the only kind. The ruling elite's agenda includes shutting off our energy supplies, raising the price of crude oil, taking up our lands and putting them in reserves of all kinds where people can't live, using every kind of limitation on what we do. Obviously, their agenda gets into religious freedom as well because of what we've seen even this past year. But we have to understand that regardless of ideology that divides us sometime between parties, that essentially everybody that we see in our lives almost certainly is one of us. We're not going to see the ruling elite. We've got to get ourselves together. We've got to exercise our political rights while we can, and we've got to save our country. We need our Constitution. We need our freedoms. We need our God-given rights. And we're going to have to fight for them one time or another. And my generation, I have to take responsibility. We've done a lot of passivism. We've done a lot of nothing. We let our young people go and fight someplace else, and when it comes to coming home, we don't show up. I thank you so much for your attention. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here. Thank you for having me.
This has been The Maddening Murder of the Middle Class, presented by Wayne Jett. To receive a free catalog of over 250 awesome Bible studies on DVD or CD, all using and defending a literal translation of the Bible, information on upcoming Bible conferences in your area, or details of our missionary outreach and trips to Israel, call Compass at 1-800-977-2177 24 hours a day, or visit us on the web at compass.org.